Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I've just realised that our Prime Minister represents Uxbridge, one of the most westerly towns in London, meaning that when the inevitable film of Boris Johnson's life is finally made, it should really be called West Side Tory. Well, moving swiftly on from that, I don't think it's too late in January to wish you a happy new year. And I'm so glad that you decided to join Musical Talk again, because we're going to start the year talking about a wonderful show that you could have seen in London on the stage at the Shaftesbury Theatre last summer and autumn, which was Be More Chill. And I hope on hearing those words you'll want to hang with me to discuss it. That is the name of one of the songs. I'm not just trying to be down with the kids. I would fail terribly. And it would make me a loser, geek, whatever. But it is a really interesting show. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, when I first heard of the show, and it wasn't a show I knew much about, the title rather turned me off. It doesn't sound like the kind of thing that would appeal to someone of my age. And yet, when I went, I thought it was a magnificent show. And that response that I had, I think is very representative of how unusual this show is, because it has both a cult following and is incredibly mainstream. And I suppose the reason it can do both of those things is that actually it's an incredibly accomplished piece of musical theatre. I was terribly impressed, and I'm happy to share my delight in that show with you today. But of course, talking about Be More Chill is a two-player game. I'm not going to do it on my own. And so, in just a minute, what you'll hear is a conversation I had with an old friend of this programme, Josh Clark, who you may remember from much of our Edinburgh Festival Fringe coverage over the last few years. Amongst other things, he's an actor, a writer, a reviewer, a musician, and a musical director. He's a man of many talents, and you might say threats, but not me. I think he's a fabulous man. I think he's just the man to talk about Be More Chill with, and I hope that when you've heard the following conversation, you'll agree. So, in terms of this conversation about Be More Chill, it's time to sync up. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Josh, very lovely to see you. Very lovely to see you in person, by the way. Feels like a return to old times, at least to a degree. How are you?
Yes, well, I'm very well, thank you. And I know, I said a moment ago, it feels like we've been putting this off for a bit of time, and it's good to finally be able to get our teeth into some shows, isn't it?
It is, and we're going to start off, I think, with a great one. This is Be More Chill, which is a proper cult classic, which has also sort of poked its head above the parapet of being a cult and made its way into the West End just recently at the Shaftesbury Theatre. Of course, it's got a huge history in a sense. It's actually been around a fair time since 2004, is that correct?
Certainly in America. Yeah. Because this production in London was, I think I'm right in saying, the UK premiere. More on that later.
Yes, indeed.
It perhaps wasn't intended to be, but certainly the professional premiere in London, yeah.
But of course, as we've said, as I understand the piece historically, it sort of was slated for an off-Broadway production and ran for 54 performances or something along that line, but never got picked up for Broadway. But then had this afterlife, which was online and has been it's been downloaded squillions of times, that's the official term, and seems to have a particular hook with the younger generation, although not exclusively, and I'm not part of that generation, and I liked it, but that has been enough to sustain it in terms of popular awareness to get it back on Broadway and the West End. So it was that West End production we saw. In a minute, we're going to talk about what the might have beens and things like that. But do you want briefly just to give an idea of what it's about, without spoilers?
Well, no, I think that's a good introduction to it, just mentioning the kind of demographic that's drawn to the show, because it is all about really individuality and the kind of person who perhaps doesn't live their whole life in the spotlight and feels as though in whatever way they might be in other people's shadows, and that comes up in a variety of different characters, doesn't it?
Yes.
But a brief synopsis, it's following the main character, Jeremy, and Jeremy is, how would he describe himself? I suppose a gamer, a bit of a geek at school is the word, isn't it?
Definitely.
Rather than nerd, but a geek, so on the gaming side, and somebody who hasn't got a lot of friends at school, that's the thing. However, in classic narrative style, there's a particular girl at school who he's got an interest in. She is a drama kid, isn't it, in terms of social group, the drama kid.
She's quite the diva in her own way.
Very much so, absolutely. And so it's a potentially quite stereotypical storyline of boy trying to get girl, but needs a bit of help along the way. So we then have a character called the Squip, who becomes almost a life coach for Jeremy in a certain way. You have to see the show to really understand what kind of life coaching the Squip
is offered.
Indeed. But it's a manic, sort of harebrained method which gets Jeremy to be able to interact with people, but at what cost?
Nicely put.
Well, yes, I know. And by the end, really, you are led to question, is it worth changing who you are to get where you want to be, or is it just nicer to be who you are and see what happens?
Now, we'll talk about that narrative in a minute, but let's get straight on to the idea of production and performance. Now, we've alluded to this already, but you, Josh, have a connection with this show which predates the London West End version and may well have resulted in, well, something rather impressive. Would you care to?
Well, and it's nice that this was the first show that we were able to see together after lockdown, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The first show back in London since things have reopened again, because I was due to have been conducting it the first week of the first lockdown in 2020. So we had the band in for rehearsals, the cast was ready to go, and then the whole thing got pulled. So that was, somehow, we managed to get the rights for the first performance of this show in the UK, but then we thought, we'll let the professionals have it. And
very generous of you.
I know, and they did a superb job, so it was nice to almost bring that unfortunate episode full circle and see it done.
But of course you're particular, you're a many-handed threat, as they say, because you can perform, but your real love, I think, and talent, particularly when it comes to theatre, is on the musical side, isn't it? And you were going to conduct, musically direct, etc. Now, I remember you telling me that the score of this is, and the way the score is delivered is so important that actually you get provided with certain materials. That sounded really interesting to me, because obviously, if I was putting on a Gilbert and Sullivan, which I'm not, but one day I lived the dream of putting Radagoa on in my own production. There's no one, obviously, because it was 150 years ago and they wouldn't have had this. But you don't even have to orchestrate it the same way. You can do it any way you like. I'm not saying you have to, but it's interesting. It's a trend of the modern era, because title of show, also not quite the same thing, but there's still a connection with the creators for each production, and I'd sort of like that. There's a kind of curation going on. But how did this? What was this for Be More Chill, the version you were going to do?
Yeah, it is an interesting thought, that, and increasingly owners of shows and owners of copyright are, I'm finding, exercising a little bit more control over their work, which is perfectly something they're entitled to do. You just mentioned Gilbert and Sullivan, and you're quite right, because shows like that, as a musical director, you have a bit more artistic freedom over.
You could do it entirely on glockenspiel if you wanted.
Well, you could do. Well, no, that is true, though, because you can pick and choose what you have in the orchestra. You can see who you've got available, and that's one thing. But I remember doing, I think, the Pirates of Penzance, and one reviewer commenting on the speed that I chose to take the overture, and the panic that ensued, that they thought the whole thing was going to be done at a tempo not to their liking. But it just illustrates the point that you can do what you like. However, Be More Chill has it's sort of in the middle of this, because a lot of shows now send through something called a click track, where the musical director wears an earpiece and essentially hears a metronomic beat, and so they conduct to that. And if someone were to come and check up on the show, the rights holders, etc., I'm sure they'd have a little metronome tool with them and make sure that
it's a tempo control.
A tempo control, yeah, exactly.
How interesting.
And sometimes added to that, sometimes there are orchestra, I guess, supplements. So if you've got a little 5-piece band, you'd have to time it to fit in with the extra orchestral sounds.
Which people might be aware of in their personal lives from karaoke albums, oddly enough, because sometimes, let's take this back to Gilbert and Sullivan, there are some Gilbert and Sullivan karaoke albums where you can merrily sing along the lead melody line, but when it comes to the repeat of the chorus, suddenly there are voices on the backing track which beef it up for you, you know, so you can be on your own in the kitchen, for example, just saying, you know, not from personal life, yes, from personal life, but suddenly there's oomph and beef and strength and power added to that situation.
That's right, and I think I'm quite glad that so far I haven't had to conduct using one of them, but I was in a production of Evita a few years ago, and the musical director there, Paul Foster, is absolutely outstanding. And yet, I think he wouldn't mind me saying it made his blood run cold, the thought of something going wrong on stage and the click track carrying on. You know, we rehearsed and drilled entrances and where to stop and how long to hold things on, absolutely to the minutest level of detail, because there is nothing you can do to change it. Anyway, let me bring it back to Be More Chill, because this is what you want to talk about. It's not quite like that, and I did have freedom over tempos and things. The beauty, I think, of this level of control from the owners of the rights is that they send you through patches and computerised sounds and effects which you put through the keyboards, which are the Be More Chill sounds, if you like, because, you know, you've heard it now.
It has a soundscape of its own, doesn't it?
It does. It's all very digital, isn't it? And almost 1980s arcade gamey a little bit.
It is, yeah.
I would describe it as
8-bit musical fun times.
Okay, well, that's one way of putting it, isn't it? But you put through these 130 different sounds on a laptop. Oh, we would have had an army of technicians doing all of this, and it really is a job for somebody to do throughout the play. You've got someone playing the music, and you've got someone else just changing the sounds for you. It's like even 10 times during certain songs. In the right place, you've got to change the sounds.
It's odd. It's at one level, it's also an odd regression, though, isn't it? It's a sort of old-fashioned radio with live sound effects, because actually the sound effects are pre-recorded, but they're cued live. I find that very interesting. That sort of it's the difference between editing afterwards and vision mixing a show on television, for example. You know, you can do it by sliding from one camera to the other as it happens live, which is the way it used to work and how live television still operates. Or you can record all the shots and then edit them together to make your narrative or interview or documentary. But it gives each a very different feel and tone. And more scope for error.
More scope for error, but I think on this occasion, this level of control works really well for this show, because if you have, let's say, an amateur group putting this production on, they will get all those sounds through, and it'll be the same sounds that the professional show has. So it's sort of a way of equalising the production values, whoever's putting it on, and it gives the whole thing a more professional feel for anybody who puts the show on. Yeah.
Well, it's a great leveller in a way then, isn't it? Absolutely. When you were building up to the performance that didn't quite take off, I mean, you got as far as technicals, didn't you?
I was rehearsing the band, and I think the day it got called was going to be just the first go through with the cast and the band. So
a fair way
we were in
through,
production
though.
week. Yeah.
Were you worried about the idea of combining the music with the live sound effects, or was that just something that you knew that your bit was going to be the bit you did, and everything else, you know, that it was someone else's job to find that? How much of a reciprocal relationship is that between you and your sound effects man, shall we say?
Well, I think it had only been the week before that I'd basically decided that one of our technicians could have the control to change the sounds and not to have me do it.
On the ground you were fairly busy.
Yeah, exactly. If I had 3 hands, you know, that would have helped. I wasn't too worried about that because, again, but very kindly, when the score comes through to you, it tells you exactly where to put it in. So as long as you've got a technician who can read music and follow bars, at least, you're fine. So, no, I think I was quite happy with that.
So it's integrated into the sheet music, as it were. Oh, that's interesting as well. And it makes absolute sense, particularly as you're suggesting that the sound effects are so often part of the sound structure of the song.
Well, this is it, because, we're saying sound effects. It's really the sound of the music. We're talking the score, aren't we? We're not talking just little sounds which punctuate it. It is the actual sound that is being churned out of the keyboard, whether it sounds like a computer in parts or whether it suddenly sounds like weird pulsing intergalactic strange things.
But how does that mesh with more conventional instruments? I mean, I've seen the show in the West End, so I know that it does. But I can imagine if you haven't seen the show, what we're talking about must sound quite strange. People have a view that an orchestra plays in the way an orchestra does. Now, of course, an orchestra is a magnificently versatile thing, and it can, as we were saying earlier, you can have any instrumentation in it. It's not even fixed at that level. So, but it might be odd to feel like you can combine electronic sounds with classical music.
Yeah, and you certainly can. And I think actually it's important to realise that you can, because I think we've spoken before on Musical Talk about the increasing trend for music just to be recorded in shows.
Well, that's true, yeah.
And for musicians to therefore be out of work. And, I think if you were to probably look at the average size of a West End musical pit band over the course of the last 30 years, it would be much, much smaller now. So even though this will sound like it is something that's been produced and recorded and just played, it is all done live. It's just modulating and playing with the sounds that comes out. So I think it's good.
Yeah, so do I. And I think that's a really striking point you've made there, that it is still a live score. Having recorded elements in a live score does not make it any less live, particularly when they're being fed in live at the right moment in accordance with and to complement the music and I say complement the music, to be the music.
It is, yeah. It is.
I find that absolutely fascinating. So your acquaintance with the score is pretty strong. And I think we should talk about this. It's particularly popular, this show, with the younger generation. Could you detect that? I mean, I suppose I'm not putting this question very well, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is, do you think the unusual and particular nature of the score is the reason for that, or a contributory factor, or is it the narrative? What is it that makes this show so appealing? How did the West End producers and the Broadway producers get it wrong by not taking it to Broadway 10 years ago?
I think the obvious answer is going to be that it's a combination of all those things, isn't it? I think probably the real draw for that particular audience will be the characters and being able to see themselves, on stage, because that is actually quite apparent in the show when you sit in the theatre and you look around.
Oh yes, the audience demographic was a particular one, wasn't it?
Very much so, and it's almost had a bit of a Rocky Horror Picture Show vibe in the sense that most people had come dressed up, hadn't they? And it was all bright neon colours and leg warmers and
a sweatshirt with creeps written on it.
That's right, yes. Or gaming t-shirts, that sort of thing. So I do think there is something about, like we mentioned at the start of this, representation and seeing versions of yourself on stage, because it is the type of character that traditionally you don't see.
Although, funnily enough, I think it's also part of a trend. I mean, Dear Evan Hansen has he's a young male character who's quite lonely, to whom a circumstance occurs, which then gives him leverage to become more socially acceptable in a particular way. I mean, that is the same plot, if described that way. It's not the same plot at all, but, that's currently in the West End as well, and I've seen that, and it's great. And you can even go back to, there's various other sort of antecedents here. I don't think it's a direct descendant of High School Musical, but you can certainly see some of the flavours. Yes,
you can, and it's a decent parallel. I suppose the difference is High School Musical, it focuses on the more popular students anyway, doesn't it? So we've got the more hidden characters from High School Musical as the protagonists here.
Well, funnily enough, I suppose if High School Musical is anything, it's a version of Romeo and Juliet, not with the same ending, obviously, but with that sense of, he's the sportsman and she's comes from a different sort of group in the school, and yet they can get together. There's a lot of that. Bringing people together through theatre might be the argument there. I'm certainly not opposed. I can't tell you what happened in the 48 sequels.
No, me neither, I'm afraid.
But then you've got Bear, which is overtly Romeo and Juliet, set in a high school. And it's once again, in this case, it's inverted. The central character is a gay character who's hiding his gayness to be popular, and is popular. He's a jock. And then as I say, moving on to Evan Hansen, I can't see the obvious Shakespearean connections, but be more chill. There is overtly a Midsummer Night's Dream in it. Every time a show turns up in a show, I know it's Midsummer Night's Dream with zombies.
It is, yeah.
Nice twist.
In space, I think.
But usually the clue is if the drama group in any musical is going to put on a Shakespeare, you know that the plot of that Shakespeare is going to be echoed in the outcome of the story to a degree. And to a greater or lesser degree. But there is a certain amount of pilfering going on in that sense. But, Shakespeare's available for everyone. And I've heard, out of copyright.
Well, indeed. And very few of Shakespeare's plots were Shakespeare originals anyway.
Well, that's true,
so.
Yeah. Christopher Marlowe might have something to say.
Marlowe, or any European writer at the time, he did the verse, but the plots largely already existed. So it's a well-established tradition, isn't it?
It is. And
borrowing.
I don't criticise. Homage, I believe the polite term is. So let us turn to the plot then. And my experience is only from the West End. I enjoyed it immediately, and I think we are going to have to touch a little bit on some of the plot points, so we don't want to ruin it. So if you haven't seen it and you don't want to know, we'll say hopefully when we're coming up to a spoiler. But I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the character who turns out to be the Jiminy Cricket, if you like, the voice that Jeremy can hear is the script character, and he's a computer program.
From Japan,
about which there is a song. I mean, that raises a very interesting question, which I'll pick up in just a minute. But the book of the show, the libretto, is based on a novel, a youth novel, actually. So it's built into the DNA in a strange sense. It's touching its demographic very successfully, having been transmogrified now into a musical, a very successful musical. But, and you were talking about borrowing plots. The thing that struck me all the way through was, essentially, Jeremy is making a deal with his script, who has variable morals. I think that would be the best way of describing it, or certainly a different moral code to the one that Jeremy starts off with. And therefore, Jeremy is bent or bends willingly to that. This is essentially a deal with the devil. This is Faust. And all the way through, it appeared to me to be a reworking of Faust. Now, I have no criticism of that. Faust is one of the absolute core plots of 20th and 21st century storytelling. Where would Hollywood be without Faust? And indeed musical theatre. I mean, Damn Yankees is Faust. So it's always nice to get Christopher Marlowe mentioned again.
Back again, yeah.
Yes, I mean, quite crikey. So good they've used him twice.
Yes.
But it therefore has that joy of being, and I think it's a joy because I think it's successful, a reworking of an established plot in some way. But where I'm going with this is, he's not the devil. He's not a supernatural character, the script. He is, if you like, the avatar of a computer program. What he represents, however, I've seen described in many, many different ways, and I'd be really interested to hear your view on this. What is the script? Bearing in mind that this is he's playing an important role. As I say, I used the word Jiminy Cricket. I mean, he's not a conscience, but he's a kind of he's a similar character to that. The invisible voice on your shoulder. And these are a group of teenagers, and teenagehood is in itself a stage of transition. So I just wondered if you have a view.
Well, the effect that it has on Jeremy really is that he behaves in a diametrically opposite way to all of his natural inclinations.
Yeah.
And the way he starts speaking to other people, the way, even down to how he starts dressing differently, is a complete transformation. And it's not a spoiler to say, morally for the worse.
Yes, I think that's fair, yes.
Because
it'd be a dull story if it actually just made him better.
Well, indeed, and that is the point, isn't it? That it's being made, that you don't need to try and be someone you're not. We've touched on that already.
All that glisters is not gold.
Indeed. So, what's the script represent? You can tell me what you might have seen about this, but you can certainly see it as representing a mind-altering substance which
it could easily be a drug.
It could, couldn't it? Which just removes inhibitions, because there are consequences for Jeremy, but other characters as well, who suffer slightly more, which are used, as a cautionary example of overdoing things, really, as well, isn't it? And overreaching, as maybe a little bit of an Icarus in there as well. So I think that's a very easy reading to take. Perhaps on a slightly easier reading, he becomes the people that he sees around him, because he has a tough time at school in the early parts of the show, doesn't he? And
yes,
so
indeed,
he sort of starts to align more with the bullies rather than his friend at the beginning.
Yeah.
And he sort of switches allegiance, doesn't he, and joins a different group.
So peer pressure.
Peer pressure.
Yeah.
Or at least he sees the other people in his school perhaps getting the results that he thinks he can't, and therefore thinks that he needs to be like them. The title of the show, Be More Chill, is the squib telling him to relax. Don't try as hard. Just, do
play it cool, man, essentially.
Cool, really.
In old lingo, yes.
Exactly.
Right. Let's go back to jazz of the 20s. Yes.
I know, very modern wording of that. So I think those are maybe two of the more obvious readings.
Oh, yes. I think there are a couple more at least, because I've certainly seen it argued. I'm not necessarily convinced, but it's. I think this is an even more modern audience imposing this on a piece of work which has existed in some form for a while. So, but social media I've seen argued. Yeah. Now I think that's actually a variant of what you're talking about, and peer pressure, because actually social media is in some senses merely peer pressure with greater leverage and greater control and power and consequences. But also, and I haven't seen this said anywhere else, but there is just puberty. It is possible, I think, to argue. I don't think you can actually make the story work this way, but you could argue that the script is in fact representative of the natural transition that occurs in every teenage boy and girl. Is it just that Jeremy's comes along at the beginning of this story? Because some of the characteristics, as you said, he starts talking and dressing in a different way. Well, that's a characteristic.
Yeah.
You escape your parents' preferences. Your parents dress you until puberty, and then you suddenly decide that you don't want to wear a tie every day or whatever. But also he starts talking to his father in a much more backhanded kind of a way, another sign of puberty. Is it? I'm not saying it is this, by the way, but I did think this is an interesting interpretation, even if it's not accurate. I thought there's a possibility of saying, well, hang on a minute, this is just a representation of what teenagers do, even without the MacGuffin of the script.
Absolutely, and the social media aspect of that is overtly present, because there is a fantastic song in Act 2 called the Smartphone Hour. Where a particular event at a Halloween party gets completely sort of changed as the characters are texting each other and sharing their versions of events, and
what used to be called Chinese whispers, actually.
Well, isn't it? Yeah, exactly that, and having power over each other by having the knowledge and releasing it bit by bit, and you do see the effects of people being completely absorbed into talking about other people. So there is that.
Can I just make another parallel back before it's rude to interrupt you, but taking us back to the puberty thing, there's I think it's 1961, there's a musical called Bye Bye Birdie by Charles Strauss, and there is a song in that, you may be aware of it, called The Telephone Hour, and in that show it represents the alienation of teenagers and their parents, or vice versa. This is the show that's got the song Kids, what's wrong with them, sung by Paul Lind, in case you're wondering what that voice was. So it's all about the generation gap, that musical, more than anything else. But isn't it interesting that, in 1961, the telephone was seen as the area where teenagers had sort of taken over control, and here we are in Be More Chill, and there's an equivalent. It's not the same, but there's an equivalent, or at least a strong resonance and parallel in the song you've just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Smartphone Hour. I mean, it's even the name of it is clearly a play on it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's clearly a reference, isn't it? I like how you mentioned how Jeremy reacts against his father as well, because I don't know, I think there's perhaps that's one part of the book, if you like, which is maybe less developed than other parts, the relationship with his father and the role that
isn't it? Yeah.
The father plays. But maybe there is also something about, something's happened in Jeremy's family life at home. His father, for much of the show, isn't, in Jeremy's eyes at least, the father he wants him to be.
Fulfilling the role as expected, yes.
No, he isn't. And so, I don't know, is there some sort of comment there about trying to find yourself in a different way with a peer group if you haven't got a solid base in other aspects of your life.
Anyway, can I say, I think the father character, you're right, the relationship isn't particularly developed, although it's sketched in enough for us to see what's going on.
Yeah.
But I think the father is awesome, and this is where it differs from Bye Bye Birdie, for example, where the father fumes against the new teenage generation that's coming in that he doesn't understand. His father here doesn't understand what's taken over his son and why his son's so different and less pleasant, but he does something which you wouldn't have seen in a 1950s or 60s drama, which is he does understand that his son is in pain in some way, and then he is oddly the dynamic that brings enough of Act Two's plot. He brings people back. He's a drawing in force rather than a pushing out force. So instead of saying, you will do as you're told and it all becomes a standoff, he actually sort of swallows his own hurt in order to help his son. I actually think he's a magnificent character.
No, I do agree with that. And I think in parts, the main sort of presentation of male characters in this is quite modern.
It is, yes.
And I would take away from it that masculinity doesn't have to be
alpha,
that's it, because Jeremy is not alpha.
No.
And when he tries to become that, he's definitely depicted in a far, far less sympathetic way. And now you've got the father who acknowledges who his son is. You've got a father who's in the state he is because they've lost the wife, the mother character. So you see him as having emotions.
He's vulnerable, isn't he?
He is, and he's battling through that. And it's the two of them, father and son together, sort of struggling to deal with something that we don't know about, that it's not explained, but dealing with some absence that they share. And so, I agree that when the two of them almost reunite or reconcile their differences by the end, it does feel like a satisfactory ending.
It does, yeah. That if you like, completes the circle.
Picking up on the ending, the final song in the show is Voices in My Head. And so we were going back and forth earlier about the interpretation of the squip. Well, surely one of them is just the voices in all of our heads and mental health.
Absolutely, yes.
And that comes out with the father-son dynamic at the end. By the end, they're talking about we've all got voices in our heads. They're always going to be there. We don't have to succumb to their whims all the time. We're human. It's a natural part of the human condition.
It is.
To have voices at various points in our lives. They're going to be stronger than at other times.
Our insecurities.
Yeah.
Yes, quite.
And because it is a male character as well, it's a very modern acceptance that everyone can suffer.
But that raises, I think, the rather interesting question that I was alluding to earlier, which is, when is this set?
Yeah.
Do you, and I'm going to say feel rather than think, because it throws it to me. It feels like it could be any time from about 1980 to now.
Yeah.
And I think that's enhanced. Some of those 80s elements to it are enhanced by, first of all, the set design. I think we have to touch on. Certainly in the West End, it was all animated, and there seemed to be two kinds of animation senses to it. There was the delineation of the rooms and situations they were in, so you got a kind of, it was done in a Tron-style animation, I think. A yellow or green line on a black background, drawing out the features of the room, the window, the door, the windowsills. Absolutely magnificent. And then there's what you might call emotional turmoil background, when actually it seems to represent the struggle of the character that's singing, quite often the Jeremy character. And kind of sort of matrixy, if you like, which brings it forward 10, 15 years from the 80s and well into the 21st century. I believe there's a new Matrix film coming out even as we speak. So, it brings it right up to now. But, that kind of... so you've got the odd difference between speech marks. The reality is in an 80s style. The turmoil is in a 21st century matrixy style, much more enhanced computer imagery, so it seems to me, and much more abstract. And I like the concept of the abstract representing turmoil. It's you're allowed to then draw what you want from the colours, if you like, not just the colours, the patterns, the feels, the emotional response that actually you're encouraged to have to a background, which is very rare in theatre. Actually, I was very taken by that. So you've got those 80s feelings drawn up by the sort of the early animation things, with the 21st century feelings for the turmoil. But then you've got the book itself. There is use of smartphone, but actually not that much. There's the script itself is a computer program, and as you quite rightly said, and there's a song, it's from Japan, and this is identified as being, therefore, sort of super modern, the latest word in technology, which is something I remember in the 80s, and indeed even in the 90s, but I don't think you'd say that now. So that knocks it back at least 20 years. I think being in a high school situation could be any time. That could take it back to the 50s. I don't think it feels 50s. I think it feels no earlier than the 80s. It comes from a book which was written a while ago, so there's that historic stuff. And I have seen it online, and I have to say that this was interesting. There's a slightly throwbacky approach to sexuality issues. There's a line, isn't there, about when Jeremy says he wants to join the dramatic club, but that's because he's after the Christine, I think it is.
Yeah.
Because he wants to be close to Christine, who's the girl he's interested in. But there's a line, isn't there, about being signing up for being called gay for the rest of your school career. Very early on, he and his best friend Michael, the bully puts matching signs on their backpacks, which together spells boyfriends, things like that. And that doesn't feel very 21st century. That feels a lot more 80s. I mean, it's all innuendo. It's not a driving part of the plot, but it's just enough sort of throwaway comments, and more than one, that makes you think, oh, right, okay, this feels a little retro.
That's right, and something to add to that was a conversation I was just having yesterday with somebody else about this, and I was describing the plot and what happens, and she mentioned to me, or asked me, how Me Too friendly does this feel, with a male character taking something which is going to help them woo a girl, or as you said, get close to them, because there is that element, isn't it? It is viewed through the male lens, really.
I think so. I think I must say it, that I think the female characters are given the character they are by the actors, and rather than by necessarily the book.
Now, perhaps it resolves itself somewhat satisfactorily, in the sense that the message is that the efforts Jeremy goes to don't work. Yeah. Ultimately, they're futile.
Toxic.
Yeah, they're toxic. So I guess that's for other people to judge for themselves.
Of course.
But it ties into what you're saying, that maybe it's not perfectly, 2021.
Well, it doesn't feel contemporary.
No.
I think that is the interesting thing. There's so much, or maybe it's a contemporary show that's been absolutely liberally coated in retro flavours. But it is interesting that against that, that we would say that those two things are things that would sort of make it less popular today. But it clearly isn't. It clearly has a resonance. So it's hard to say on paper why that would be the case.
Well, does it go back to the link you drew with Faust earlier on? And why has that been so popular for the last 400 years? Well, it's because Faust could be an everyman character.
That's true.
And it's all about human desires, isn't it? And so,
and there's redemption in this as well.
Redemption.
If he wasn't redeemed, it would be a much harder take. Be a much harder pill to swallow, if you pardon the expression.
Yeah, but there probably is something of the, if not every man, a lot of people will be able to identify with some aspect of Jeremy, in the sense of feeling like an outsider in some way, in the sense of unfulfilled desires, if you like, in the sense of battling with home life versus public life. I think that's a large part of it.
I think you must be right. I mean, it touches on enough truths. The world we want to live in, even now, we talk of all these great concepts of mutuality. But actually, 21st century isn't like that. It might be our aspirational position, but it isn't. And there's still a place for looking at how things can go wrong. Let's go back to, as you say, Faust, and so many dramas. actually, you have to. So many dramas start off with a dystopia, which has to then be got through to get to the utopia, and you can't therefore demonstrate a dystopia without some bad things. If it was a dystopia that was a bit lovely and cuddly, I think it's probably not that dystopian. However, I personally, but then again, I'm of an older generation. I spotted those things, those feelings and flavours and moments, but they were absorbed in the whole. I mean, it wasn't, the sexuality issue. It just isn't about that.
No.
It absolutely isn't about that. I've seen some criticism that one of the characters at the end, after the resolution, sort of throws in that he's happily bisexual, and people are saying, I have seen it argued that that's a little bit throwaway, and isn't that played for laughs? There is a concept, however, that that character has suffered particularly during the course of this story. It's Rich. That's the name of the character. I'm not making an observation about anything there. That's not an adjective. But actually, the turmoil of coming to terms with your own sexuality is still an important driver in society today. And so I can sort of understand that as a motivation for why he went off the tracks earlier on. The very fact it's added at the end is, I think, supposed to suggest that, look, that it's fine and he's come to terms with it. And the detoxification of that character has taken place as a result. But it is done so quickly and so, not comically, but lightly, that I can see that people might say, well, hang on a minute, this is too important to throw away like that. But I think that's... I don't think the play is about sexuality. So,
No, I think you're right. And because it is so clearly focused on Jeremy and his story, there are threads which are mentioned here and there, you've said, that don't get picked up on, which you might feel could be, but they don't, and it's not about that.
No, it really isn't. And I think this undercuts what we've been saying, actually, and the general consensus. This is actually a really very good, well-written, well-produced piece. The book is good, the songs are excellent, and we should talk about those. And the production we saw was top notch. I thought, there's very little to mark down as though we were in any kind of position to do that.
Oh, it was excellent, and very young cast, so it was bursting with
talent,
dynamism, talent and energy, and you come out of this show feeling very upbeat.
You do, indeed,
I would suggest, and that it's just been a really good few hours watching something fun. It feels like there is a point to it as well, which
isn't always the case.
No, it isn't always the case. And maybe for the early parts of it, you might think that it's not going to have a really strong heart, but I think it actually does. And again, that's why this, in the main, very young audience, I think like it, because it's very funny.
It is.
There are moments which are pretty close to the bone, so you have the few, sucking through your teeth, like, oh, they've gone there. And so you cut through all of that. There's amazing costumes. There's this crazy Halloween party at the start of Act 2, which is fantastic.
It's a feast for the eyes, let alone the ears.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? And as you mentioned, all these neon lights that are going on, it's very simple in its design.
It is.
Which is great for a show straight after, the coronavirus, because it's something which is easily just put on. It takes a lot of work to program all this, but aesthetically...
But once you've got it, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It works really well, but it does have that real heart running through it as well, and I think you feel for quite a few of the characters. You buy into their story, don't you? And having said that it tracks through this central plot line, I think both of us found one of our favourite songs to be by not Jeremy and not Christine, but Jeremy's friend, Michael, who again is very relatable in the sense that his big number, Michael in the bathroom, he finds himself there at this Halloween party,
which he's gate crashed because he's not been invited.
Right, okay, well that's an important thing, and he's gate crashed it, but when he gets there he realises that he's not the sort of person that is going to gate crash and be the life and soul of the party. He'd much rather just be on his own. He feels very awkward and shy and uncomfortable, and so locks himself in the bathroom, and we really get a soliloquy through song about his mental condition, don't we really?
It is. Funny enough, I've read it said that there is an underlying, not overt, but an underlying sense of suicidal impulses throughout the piece. I don't want to overplay that, but I can sort of understand, if Michael, well, I'm glad it didn't happen, but if Michael had decided to take what's laughably called the easy way out at any point in the plot, it wouldn't have been terribly out of place in the piece. You can see it could incorporate that. I'm so glad it didn't. And I just want to briefly talk about Michael's role when we get back to that song, because Michael as a character, so often in cartoons we were talking about the devil and Faust and the script being at least an avatar for that character. When you think in cartoons, you often see a character wrestling with their conscience and have a little devil on one shoulder and a little angel on the other. I mean, no one is quite all a devil and no one is quite all an angel, but actually Michael is the empathy which Jeremy hasn't yet developed, either pre or after script, actually, I think, but particularly after. So there's a very, I think he would be the closest we get to the good voice, and of course is so often sidelined, including by Jeremy once the script is making him figuratively and genuinely invisible, as it were.
No, this is the thing, and he's very important just in terms of the plot, because he's loyalty, he's the goodness in Jeremy's life, which Jeremy doesn't see in his quest for more. So, a lot of it is that we should appreciate the people we do have and see the good in our lives. When our minds get dominated by what if and more, and I'm not satisfied.
FOMO as well.
Of course, but Michael stays with Jeremy all the way through, and he gets treated pretty appallingly
terribly.
in parts.
And indeed, at this party, it's one of the reasons he's in the bathroom, is because he's actually been rejected overtly, hasn't he, by Jeremy?
That's right. So it's a really emotional song, and he has his private moment, and then he comes out of the bathroom and he puts on the mask again, doesn't he, really, and carries on.
But why is the song so great? Because it is. You turned to me just before it started and you said, this is the best song in the piece, and you also said, this is an audition song.
Yeah.
So do you want to clarify a little what you meant by that?
Well, I mean, first off, just musically, it's excellent, isn't it?
It is.
It's very catchy. It's got the musical theatre build to a great crescendo and climax that everyone wants, at least once in a show. And it's a great song to act through as well.
There's a journey this being described, isn't there?
Yeah, and maybe I'll tell you what it is. I think a lot of the musical numbers in this, well, a lot of their purpose is to advance narrative, and a lot of it is storytelling, isn't it, and done to music. Whereas this is a set piece frozen in one particular moment about a character here and now, and so I think it's got a lot more depth to it than a lot of the other songs. Even though I love the music of the others, we just focus in, and it's intimate and again very identifiable.
It's one man's pain.
Yes.
And as you say, who hasn't had pain? But it's got a couple of parallels, I think, with the rest of the score, funnily enough. It's interesting. Jeremy's opening number, the ensemble piece in Act 1, is called More Than Survival. That's about his pain. And at that stage of the story, he's only coping with that by having one friend, Michael, and basically keeping his head down, because any attempts to raise it are going to be, see him bashed on the head like a whack-a-mole machine. Not that that's mentioned. But the other parallel is two-player games.
Yes. Well, this was what I was going to pick up next, actually, because the two of them, Michael and Jeremy, sing this song, Two-Player Game, and in that very early part of Act 1, they're both quite content for their lives at that stage to be a two-player game which they share together.
They're actually playing a game on a sofa, aren't they, basically?
Yeah.
So that's the connection. It's quite a nice parallel, I think.
Yeah, it is. And they both see elements of themselves in the other. They feel like it's them against the rest of the school in a way. Yes, we get picked on, but we both do in the same way, and it's fine because we'll go through it together. And then really the drama, I suppose, of this relationship is that remains the case for Michael all the way through, but it isn't enough for Jeremy.
It's the choreography of two-player game is very good as well, because you can see them. They've got their little handset, so they're facing us, the audience, but we are the television screen for them, which is ironic because there's a screen behind them with the projected background. It's lovely circles, but they are sitting on this sofa or two seats, and they are playing in harmony. So when one rocks, the other one rocks over. They roll, they move. Their moves are absolutely synchronised all the way through this song, which physically underlines the symbiosis between the two characters, which at that stage is their strength.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just casting my mind back. I think it's probably the only genuine, or I might have just thought one exception, but one of very few just pure duets in the show, which underlines that relationship even more. The other one being the fantastically entitled Pants Song, which is Michael and Jeremy's father towards the end, which again is all about relationships, but apart from that, it's ensemble or the occasional solo, really.
Very American cultural, though, isn't it? Because obviously it's widely known that pants in America are pantaloons, they are trousers. Pants in this country are underpants. So all the way through Act 1, we see the father in just his pants because he's taken to not wearing his trousers, as we would say.
Yes.
If you're American, it's the pant which is missing. In Britain, it's the pant you can see. And then, of course, there's that cultural reference, which is a term we don't use here later on. Big boy pants is mentioned about growing up, back to coming out of the transition of teenagerdom and back to what our script means. But big boy pants is not a British term. We're aware of it from culture, and you see it on films and television, so we understand what it means. But I don't think most people would colloquially use it in this country. Because once again, big boy pants, if you use it at all, would be presumably the transition from nappies when you're wetting yourself to being able to be lavatory trained. We're taking on a strange path here, but I only mention that because it in no way acts as a barrier, because we're aware of the culture, but it's not quite our cultural references here in the UK. But it caused me no trouble whatsoever. But I am always amused by the pant issue. I must say it's the male equivalent of and I'm sorry to mention this word because in Britain it means something else, but fanny. When people talk about fanny bags in America, they mean a bum bag, as we would call it. Whereas, as you know, and there's a wonderful song by Cole Porter, which British and American singers have to sing differently because I can't remember what the song's called, but the lyric is something like the woman who's singing is remembering her grandmother and my dear old granny tapped me on the fanny, and then that's how the song opens. Whereas British singers, and I've heard a few British singers do it, they've had to reword it.
Yes, you would really.
I think that's nothing more than a tangent, really, for the sake of it. But I always do enjoy those little moments of cultural surprise. Two nations separated by the same language, as I think Churchill put it. But this takes us back to the point that Michael in the Bathroom is the standout song.
Yeah, and I think it's such a humanising song. There's no joking around in it, actually.
Yeah, it's absolutely straight, isn't it?
Yeah, all of our sympathies and empathy is with Michael at this point. We know the sort of character that he is, someone who's isolated socially, somebody who doesn't have the best journey through life himself. We don't know much about his family background, and yet he's shown to be thoroughly decent as a human being all the way through.
And centred.
And yeah, actually, very centred, very rational, really invested in his friendships. And so I think this song just really shows that you shouldn't judge people, isn't it? Because you don't know how people are feeling, and this song almost just erupts out of him, doesn't it? At the end. It doesn't to begin with. It starts off very quiet. It starts off like Michael. He's thinking about the situation and just being uncomfortable. But by the end,
it becomes a cri de coeur.
Yeah, it's all of his emotions, which he never lets out because he's always thinking about others. And he does all this in private as well.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he's physically locked in. There are people knocking on the door, aren't they? Because they want to use the lavatory as part of this party, and which oddly adds. See, the song has the potential to be both pathetic and pathetic, but I think it avoids both. I think it's actually, it really comes across. It's absolutely sincere. It's absolutely truthful. I think you'd said that much better than I, but it's it could be any one of us. We've all felt isolated. We've all discovered our friends have all gone to a party that we've not been invited to, or whatever. At various stages of our life, we've all felt at some stage left out.
Yeah, and that knocking on the bathroom door is rather symbolic as well, isn't it? Because Michael actually vocalises that and sings it as knock, 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 knock. I think he says, I feel the pressure building up. And it's all these thumps, metaphorically speaking, that he feels being, pushed and pulled around the society of the school, which he just endures.
He's the human flotsam there, isn't he?
Right, but there's only so far you can endure it before something gives way somehow.
So all in all then, we've got nothing but praise really for Be More Chill.
No, and I really do want that to come across in the end of this conversation, because whenever we speak, we think very hard, don't we, about the meanings of things and talk about particular moments and interpretations. And sometimes I think maybe, just being aware of myself speaking about the show, maybe that lends a almost sort of clinical feel to how we dissect it. But I really recommend the show so highly. I was so disappointed that we weren't able to put it on, because the cast were outstanding and the show meant so much to them as well. And that brings us back to the audience, because the group I was working with were the audience that we saw in London. It was exactly that same group, and they had such an emotional connection to their characters.
Absolutely.
It was wonderful to see it. I'd recommend this to absolutely anybody. Do go and see it. You don't have to read into it as much as we did, but you just have a great time with this music. At the very least, try and find it on Spotify or online somewhere. It's well worth listening to.
You have said it better than I could, but your own cri de coeur there, your from the heart analysis and conclusion on Be More Chill is 100% correct. Before we even started recording, we both said if this came back to London, we'd be there like a shot. This is a show that deserves its legacy.
It does. Might I just sort of put my hands up in a mea culpa moment here, because when I first heard of it, I wasn't aware of it before the group approached me and asked me to work on it, and I just heard the name Be More Chill, and I thought, what does that mean? I don't think I'm quite in this demographic. I don't understand this. This is going to be a piece of froth, basically. But I completely misjudged it, and I did sort of judge it immediately by the cover. And the whole show is about not doing that. And the more I worked with the cast and got to really get to grips with it, the more it came to mean to me as well. So,
Well, I'm a generation on top of you, as it were, old fella, but I agree absolutely. The title turned me off originally when that was once again all I knew. And yet, thank you so much for taking me by the hand and leading me there, because it was you who carried me there, essentially. Because I think this is a great show, and a show that will stay in my canon of happy places to go, as it were, musically, for many years, I think. This has been one of the best shows in London for a while.
Good. Well, we can't really endorse it more than that, can we?
We cannot. Josh, thank you so much for your time. Funny enough, the show's called Be More Chill, but I always feel sort of warmed by your presence and heated by your intellectual insight. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Musical talk. And there we are, the wonderful Josh Clark talking about Be More Chill with me when we saw it in London at the Shaftesbury Theatre last September. That's September 2021. And when it comes to reviewing shows, Josh is definitely a guy that I'd kinda be into. And he certainly helps upgrade my comments into something much more sensible. Yes, you get the idea by now. I'm inserting names of songs into what I'm saying. And I'm only doing that because I don't have anything else sensible to say, because we have essentially reached the end of this episode. If you get a chance ever to listen to or see Be More Chill, do give it a whirl. I think it might surprise you if you don't know it, and if you do know it, you'll be aware already what a great show it is. And it certainly was in its London production. Well, join us again here on Musical Talk next week, and we'll be talking about something completely different. As you know, that is very much our MO, our modus operandi. We like to talk about anything and everything that tickles our musical theatre fancy. And if you like your musical theatre fancy tickled, and I jolly well hope that you do, come back next time and we'll try to do that. In the meantime, I'm going to finish this episode with the well-worn and tried and tested word which always brings an episode to a shuddering climax, and that is goodbye. And here's me saying it. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Josh Clark, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. You never told me who won the football match.
Who won the football match? Oh, Plymouth Argyle won the football match. That's why my glasses went flying in excitement. Top of the league at the moment.
Are they?
We are indeed.
Is that because their striker now has a new pair of spectacles, which they unexpectedly landed on them and they can see where the goal is?
Because the referee got the spectacles, so everything changed.
Really? They just flung off in excitement?
Yeah, I got very excited. There's somewhere in Wimbledon. I've got a spare.
That's fine, by the way.
Yeah.
So. Right, well, God, I feel awesome. I haven't done this face-to-face for such a long time, so thank you. I've read it said that there is an underlying, not overt, but an underlying sense of suicidal impulses throughout the piece. I don't want to overplay that, but I can sort of understand, if Michael... Well, I'm glad it didn't happen, but, if Michael had finished himself off... I'm going to say that again, that's entirely the wrong phrase for a bathroom.